Right. So, Hasini, tell us about you. I believe you're from Panadure. Is that correct? Is that where
Yes,
you're born?
correct. So, yeah, so I am from Panadura, and then I schooled actually also in Panadura until my OLs, and later in Colombo. And then most of my higher education has been abroad in India, where I studied sociology, in Lund University, Sweden, where I did my master's in Asian studies, and later on where I specialized in museology and oral history at Columbia University, New York. So that's basically where I come from academically. Yeah.
So you jumped the gun because I was going to take it slowly with you.
Okay.
Right. It's all right. It's okay. So
Yeah, okay.
you studied in Butchapan Convent in Panadura. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, I did.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you moved on to Sri Lanka to do LLS.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
So are you still living in Panadura, or you're now?
I live in Mount Lavinia and Panadura both, because Panadura is where my family comes from, and my home is really Panadura. So even today I'm joining you from Panadura, in fact. So yeah.
Excellent. So Hasini, your interests are very wide. You say you like history, you like arts. It's a funny combination. And when did you start to love history and arts and whatever you're doing now?
Yeah, so I mean, I have to admit that in school, history wasn't so much my favorite subject. That's because of the way we are taught history in school, which is not very interesting. It's a lot about kings and dates, and like really that doesn't make sense to a lot of people. But much later on, when I graduated, started working. Then I started working a lot with Sri Lanka's political situation and Sri Lankan conflict. And I started understanding that history is really very, very important part of it, part of defining who we are, etc. And then fortunately, I started working with, school students, university students. I'll talk a little bit about it even also in my presentation. And then also my further studies that sort of opened me to different ways of teaching, learning in museums, and then I sort of really discovered this beautiful area of work. So it wasn't an easy journey. It took me a long route to get there, but I'm glad that's the way it is. Like you say, nobody really dreams of becoming a museologist in life because nobody really knows that it exists, right? So for me, it was really nice that I sort of discovered that as an area of studying and as an area of research. So I'm very happy to sort of taken that long winding route there.
It's very interesting you said that history is very boring in school, because that's one of the subjects which I hated in school, in junior school. But that's one of the subjects I really love at the moment.
Yes.
So I had this discussion with Professor Raj Somadeva when I was in Sri Lanka. He's going to address SLLS in a month's time. And he agrees with you. And he said they're trying their best to now change the curriculum.
Yes.
Is there any attempt from your part to get involved in such a project to change history?
Like, definitely. I mean, I've had my failures and little victories. So I mean, I'm sorry if this is going to take too much time, but one of the most life-changing experiences for me was when I took part in a study program organized by 3 different countries. That is, Germany and Canada and Poland got together and did this wonderful course called Learning from the Past and Teaching for the Future. So it was basically aimed at training history teachers, and especially about how to teach difficult histories to students in a beautiful way, in an engaging manner. So once I went through that program and came back to Sri Lanka, I really felt like I have to do something with this knowledge. And fortunately, I was working for the German Development Corporation at that time, which had an education project with the Ministry of Education. So through that, I went and tried to work with the National Institute of Education in training history teachers. But it was really not very easy because history is a very sensitive subject. And at the time, I was also very, very young. I was about 26, 27 years old, and people there really didn't look at me very positively. You know, I didn't have a PhD. I wasn't old enough to be, sort of bring up these ideas. But fortunately, some of my colleagues who worked in Columbia University picked up that idea. And we got together and did a lot of field work, taking students out into the heritage sites, taking students into the museums, and trying to learn history through that, really taking the history out of the history textbook and out of the classroom and trying to experience it through that. So for me, like in Sri Lanka, until COVID happened, I used to do a series of museum walks and heritage sites walks, especially just to get young people involved in the museum and involved in heritage, involved in this whole idea of identity, why it's important, etc. So those are the kinds of things that I've done, and actually they have drawn lots of positive feedback, and people really ask for these museum visits and heritage walks. But I do have a bit of difficulty when I try to work with the bigger education system and the curriculum. That's a little challenging. Yeah. Ruan, you're muted.
I muted myself to stop the disturbance from our household, but sorry about that. Okay, so let's get on to what happened after your A-level. So did you go straight to India to do the primary degree?
Yes, I did, also because I got this Indian Cultural Exchange Scholarship between the government India and government of Sri Lanka. And at that time, there was also a gap of waiting to get into the university in Sri Lanka, and I also wanted to avoid getting into law, because I actually did manage to get into the faculty, but law wasn't something that was in my heart. So to avoid all those pressures, because if you do well in O-levels, you have to study science in your A-levels. And if you do well if you manage to stay away from science and do arts and then do well, then you also get forced into becoming a lawyer, then, because we have these set ways of what people think are like, good professions to get into. So I've sort of really tried to avoid that. And in a way, going to India was one way of like sort of avoiding those traps. And I just loved it. And again, India was a lovely place to study sociology, lovely place to study history. I did take history as my minor subject, although my sociology was my major. So I studied history of India and European history, even at that time. And it was wonderful because, Delhi is a very historic city, and it was like living inside a live museum, which is heritage sites everywhere. So that's where also my love for history started growing, really, India, because it's so full of civilization and history and culture. So my love for arts and culture, my love for art, my love for history, all of that got really fostered there.
Thank you very much. So after that, you did a master's degree in Asian Studies in Lund University in Sweden. So tell us a little bit about your experience there.
Yeah, I think Lund was really interesting because for me, they changed the way I knew education as it was. As if you know, Scandinavia has really good education methods, like when it comes to methodology. So even at the university level, we were really encouraged to learn in groups. We were really encouraged to, engage in activities like school role plays and real, work on real issues. So in terms of methodology of teaching, I thought Lund was a game changer for me. And also I was growing, I was much more mature than I was as a graduate student. So I was becoming more savvy in terms of politics, and you also start seeing things from a different perspective because you're outside rather than looking at it from inside the country. So all these different perspectives came in, and that was really important period of my life. And also the whole interdisciplinary approach, because there you leave these subject boundaries and start looking at things as topics which are interrelated. So that was something I really enjoyed.
Right. So following that, I believe you went to States to study history and anti-racist education at York University. Is it which university?
Oh no, yeah, that York program is the program I told you about, which sort of changed my way of looking at history, organized by Germany, York University, Toronto, and Krakow University in Poland, and the Civic Institute for Education in Baden-Württemberg in Germany. That was a short course, but that was really important. And for me, this is also why I feel that sometimes these shorter courses are also much more interesting than regular courses that we take as degree and masters. That was a shorter course which ran for 1 year, but it inspired me to come and do a lot of similar work in Sri Lanka. So the work that I went on to do with the University of Colombo, University of Jaffna, were actually inspired by that work. But it's not something that I gained any particular degree from. It was just a professional training that sort of really helped me get along with my professional work. Yeah.
Right. So I believe after coming back to Sri Lanka, you were part of what we call the GIZ, or German Society for International Cooperation. You worked for about 10 years. What was your job? What involved in?
So GIZ is a German Development Cooperation. It is a the parallel of DFID, by the way, if you compare it with England. So it's a German government working with the Sri Lankan government on a host of topics. And I worked on the topic of peace education, because at that particular time, around 2007 that I joined, the war was still going on, and war was a huge issue. And there was this real effort to sort of focus the next generation to deal with a peaceful society, how to get towards that. So I worked a lot with peace education. I worked a lot with art and artist groups, theater groups, and photographers and filmmakers. And that was a lot of exciting work done in the cultural arena. On peace building and peace education. And that was also where I got connected to this program on teaching history, where I started feeling that more and more the way we teach history in schools has a connection to how we shape the future of our country. So that was becoming clear for me through that work in GIZ.
So are you currently with the International Center for Ethnic Studies in Sri Lanka? Or
yes, I'm a fellow at the International Center for Ethnic Studies. After GIZ is when I actually went on to study museology and oral history in Colombia. So that was after doing that, I wanted to sort of step out of international development work and be more engaged in museums, more engaged in history education. So I sort of stepped out of that 10-year project and became an independent consultant. So some of my research I do through International Center for Ethnic Studies, but I also work outside. So I'm basically an independent consultant that has associations with several different organizations at the moment.
Okay, so museology is quite new to most of us, and even to many colleagues in Sri Lanka. So what does your day job involve? Now, I've read that you're doing some of taking people around in museums, but that's not your main job. What actually involves your main job?
So as a museologist, for me, what was important was like, how do I use this knowledge that I gained in New York back in Sri Lanka? I did a course I worked in a New York museum called Lower East Side Tenement Museum. And then to come back and sort of see, like, what can I do? How can I apply this knowledge to Sri Lanka? You know, and it was also a fellowship. So I felt like it's my duty to give that back to my country. So then what I found that in Sri Lanka, it's exactly what you are saying. Although we speak a lot about history and say we are very proud of our history, we don't really take good care of it. We don't really do a lot in that arena. So actually, we didn't even know how many museums were out there. So when I even went and tried to talk to museum people, it wasn't clear. It's exactly what you're saying. Nobody knows about museology. Nobody really, it's not something that's on top of your mind. So one of the first things that I've done is to sort of really sort of push the topic onto the table on Sri Lanka by doing this research. So I did a baseline research of finding how many museums are out there in Sri Lanka, really, because nobody really knew that. And I found, to my surprise, that we have around 120 museums right now. So and I didn't visit all of them, but I picked 25 out of them and did this museum study, which I will also share with you, and I will draw from in this presentation. So what I did was really laying the groundwork, the very basic fundamental work in museology. So that was published. Then I started doing these museum walks. Currently, I'm compiling a glossary of museological terminology in Sinhala and Tamil, because at the moment, we don't really have words in Sinhala or standardized words in Sinhala and Tamil to study museology and do that in Sri Lanka. And if you go to museum in Sigiriya, museum in Anuradhapura, museum in Jaffna, you know that our museum professionals, they are not English speaking, they work in Tamil and Sinhala. And there is no communication or no standardization of terminology. So at the moment, I'm compiling together with a group of other 22 museology people in the country, both from the north, from Jaffna, Batticaloa, and Colombo, to sort of come up with a glossary. So a lot of the work that I'm doing right now involves research, setting standards, getting people together and creating a momentum about it, speaking in platforms like this, trying to push this whole topic forward and making sure that people connect to museums in the right way.
Excellent. And lastly, I believe you have written several books, and I have seen one of the books in a bookshop, and I have another one. I bought one. So tell us about your books. I was
well, yeah, I mean,
I was
so I think
interested in that Reflections of 70 Years of Independence one.
Yes.
It's a really nice book. I just browsed it in Saraswati bookshop. Just tell me something about.
Yeah, again, this is about history, because if you look at our history textbooks, they all stop at the 1948 independence. We are really not taught anything about what happened to our country, what did we go through after that. We really don't know, and that, I think, is critical, and it is behind some of the mistakes that we are making as a country today, in the political sphere, in the social sphere, in the economic sphere. So the idea of archive of memory is to sort of try to collate a history of Sri Lanka through the perspective of common people. For instance, all of you have sort of lived through more or less the last 4 or 5 decades, and you all know certain things that happened. Some of you have been there, this happened, that happened, and there's a lot of knowledge that's there in people's memory. So what we tried to do was actually to sort of trace these memories, these little stories that people have, which are not just their personal memory, but is actually a part of the collective memory of our country. For instance, there's a story about a person who as a child, acted in the Independence Day parade in 1948. That we start with that, you know. Then there is a person who talks about how language changed while they were schooling, and suddenly they had to switch from English to Sinhala, and how that happened, you know. There are stories of how people lived through 1970s Sirimao Bandaranaike's regime, 88, 71, and the war, of course, 30 years of war. So there's a lot of different stories of how people have experienced Sri Lanka's 70 years of independence. And the attempt was to collect all of them with my colleague, Malathi Dialvis. Unfortunately, she passed away about a year ago. Actually, 21st was her memorial. 1 year back, she passed away. So now I'm the only one who is sort of curating it, but it was co-curated by Dr. Malathi Dialvis of Columbia University and myself. And yeah, our attempt was to really collate all these personal stories of how people lived through Sri Lankan political history.
I think with that introduction, I think our audience have got to know who you are, at least to a certain extent. So the forum is yours now. You can now share your PowerPoint presentation and we'll ask questions afterwards.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, let me know. Can you see it?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So yeah, I have sort of called it Polonnaruwa Politics of Discovery, Interpretation and Representation. I thought the best way is to pick a site and take you through that. So I'm warning you, I have about 48 slides ahead of us, but they're all photographs. So it's not about text. I just want you to see some of the documentation work that we've done, and I hope you enjoy it. And I want to talk about my own story with Polonnaruwa. I mean, I think I picked Polonnaruwa because through my work, I've started coming back to Polonnaruwa all the time, and it really got into my blood. For instance, this is a photograph of one of the most unforgettable things I was a part of, where we managed to actually do a concert in front of the Parakramabahu Palace, or Vaijayanti Palace, as we call it in Polonnaruwa. And then the work that I told you about with students in that I already told you about. So really taking students who are studying history, archaeology out there onto the sites and helping them to navigate it and see them through very different eyes, especially from very different interpretation of what we normally hear and absorb through, for instance, television or our school, or even in our own families that we talk a lot about, history, how to look at it in a different way, so that we also look forward in creating a more, a wholesome society. So I feel especially connected with Polonnaruwa, and I feel it's one of the sites that can sort of lead us or give us clues to our future. So that's what I chose it. And these are the two books that have come out recently. And for this presentation, I am drawing from both of them. So Museums, Memory and Identity Politics in Sri Lanka is what Ruan just picked up on, where I studied 25 museums in Sri Lanka and basically setting standards and saying what's out there, where are we in terms of our displays, our educational programming, and how do we sort of work with our museums. And I did one case study on Polonnaruwa Museum, which I will present to you in the course of this presentation. And the book that just came out last week is called Shared Sanctities. That is a 2-year research. It went on a little bit long, actually, on several heritage sites, not only Polonnaruwa, which looks at art and architecture of sacred sites in Sri Lanka, and try to represent them and reread them through a lens of personal discovery. So this has 5 different essays where I actually, personally, go and explore these places, because Museums, Memory and Identity Politics is more like a straightforward academic publication, but Shared Sanctity is for a general reader. Anyone can read it. It's simply written as travelogues. And in this project, we also managed to do a series of video film clips. And at some point, I would like to invite all of you also, when we are organizing an online launch, probably in February, I would really pass the message on to you so that you can also join and see some of those things and listen to some of the experts who spoke on these sites. So I'm going to draw from both of these studies, which happened, one in 2017 and one in 2019, 20, up to now, really. Yeah. And I want to sort of break the presentation into 3 parts, because I named it about discovery, interpretation, and representation. So first of all, I wanted to look at how we started discovering our own history, especially through colonial rulers. Then I'm going to take you through Polonnaruwa archaeological site and trying to understand what these buildings actually tell us when we look at it and when we start reading with knowledge about their architecture and art. What are the secrets that these sites are telling us? And then the third portion is about representation. How have we represented this story that we can read through the archaeological museum? And then if you read things as they are in Tivanka Image House, which is one particular building in Polonnaruwa, how can we understand? So this is how I'm going to sort of break it up. And what I suggest is, to avoid me speaking for a long time, that after each section, discovery, I will give a break and we can go into some questions and answers. Interpretation, we can stop and do some questions and answers, and representation, do some question and answers. So like we get 3 breaks and we go into that. Is that all right, Ruwan? I mean, I'm just proposing that to the group as a way forward.
Yeah, that would be fine, Hasini. Yeah.
Okay. So let's go on to the first part, which is about discovery. You know, one of the things that I started trying to understand when I started visiting Polonnaruwa was, like, how did we get to know the story that we know right now and say right now about Polonnaruwa? And I traced it back to the British colonial civil servants, how they sort of discovered it, you know, because this is the kind of history, this is the kind of archaeology that all of us learn in schools and universities at the moment. It's really a colonial project. Now, my colleague, Professor Jagat Veerasinghe, who is the director at the Central Cultural Fund, actually questions this word discovery. He says, what do you mean discovery? It was discovered by the Suddhas or the colonials, but obviously people who lived in that area, the locals knew them, they were used and all of that. But what the colonials did was to sort of locate these places, document them in the forms of photographs, like for instance this one by Joseph Lawton in 1870, and write about them. So what the colonials actually started doing was, in terms of discovering these sites, was representing these sites also, because documenting, photographing, writing about this, all of that. So during the times of the British colonial administration, a lot of the administrators, now for instance whom you see, they were all civil servants. They were not archaeologists or trained museologists or trained historians most of the time. They were just people who felt passionate about discovering history, etc., and went around and did a lot of these stuff. And it's actually, I mean, I'm grateful for that because they're really beautifully done. So this is Watadage, by the way, and this is Kirivihera, how that was when they, the British looked at it, how Kirivihera looked in Polonnaruwa at that time. I also recommend this very nice book by Ismat Rahim called Archaeology and Photography, the early years, which includes some of the work by Joseph Lawton and how he sort of recorded Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa both. And this is how Kirivihera looks now, as opposed to what it looked like back then. So the colonizers started looking at Sri Lanka and recording, I mean, actually Ceylon, there was no Sri Lanka back then, in a very particular way. And, you know, you all know John Steele's Jungle Tide. I don't know, we didn't learn it in school, but I know that back in 1950s, 60s, it was even read as a text for English, etc. So this paragraph I take because it really sums up what we historians call colonial gaze, you know. So I'm going to read it out for you. So in John Steele's writes, in the north of Ceylon, as of England, I repeat, as of England, there is a borderland where two races meet. You see, immediately you start seeing how do these colonial civil servants start understanding the history of Ceylon. They are understanding it through their own history of England, you know, so their own borderland between Scotland and England up north, their own two races meeting. And then they really import that into understanding north of Ceylon. And actually, this was not accurate if you really go back into the archives and trying to find what was life actually about. There were no concept of race at that particular in the times of the pre-colonial times in Sri Lanka. The labels of Sinhalese or Tamil race was not really present in the way that we understand it today, you know. And there were very many more races like Gadi and different types of categories and types of people than the categories that we understand. But the colonizer always understand it through their own history, which I understand, I empathize with, but that created problems for us later on, obviously. And here is another lovely quote that I like. I discovered in the ruins of a lovely pond built of stone slabs, carved to resemble the open flowers of a lotus. And strangely enough, what appears to be in this very pond was already known to me, though no one then had found it, for it is described in the Mahavamsa as being built in a garden by a king who died about the time that Richard Coeur de Lion came to the throne of England. Again, the same thing, you know. So you're referring back to British history to understand Sri Lankan history. This is what was happening in colonial Sri Lanka. And this is not from Polonnaruwa, but this is a photograph of HCP Bell in Sigiriya with his labor force. I just find it an interesting picture because you see the pyramid and the power hierarchy right there when you look at the photograph. You see the laborers and you see the colonial administrator at the top of it. You see the intermediary sitting, standing next to him. So, you really start understanding what the colonial system was at that time by looking at this picture. And in a way, the system that we still continue to date. If you look at all our administrative officers, our government, our state sector, how it's run, you see this pyramid still. It's just the white man is no longer there, but the pyramid still continues the same way. So and here is a quote by W.H. Gregory, which I came across when I was studying the Colombo Museum and reading into their archives. Why I find this quote very interesting is because I hear in Gregory's words what I also hear much later on in the nationalist struggles. So he is really looking at Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, Ceylon as a very, very particular place and really exoticizes it. For instance, it was strange that nothing of the kind had been previously attempted, and yet all the other colonies united could not furnish such a collection of objects of such varied interests as Ceylon. You know, this is hyperbole. You know, obviously, I think we have a wonderful, varied collection of Ceylon, but you also know the British were in Egypt, and British were all over the world. I mean, and you know that there are also world heritages which are equally rich. But this way of really exoticizing and talking about Sri Lanka in a very unique way, without really making it a part of the rest of the world and rest of Asia, especially part of the Indian subcontinent, is something that we see taken up by the nationalists, and sometimes even supporting extreme nationalism in most cases. This is why I picked this to show that how the colonial thinking sort of shaped what was to come afterwards. And then, of course, you know, the colonizers started looking at all these, documenting all the histories. The Mahavansa was translated by Geiger to German, to English, and all of that. And then, voila, we started having a history, right? So till then, there was no history in the grand sense for the locals. History was what they knew through their oral traditions, etc. But because of the British and because of these attempts, and then the school system, the missionary education, we started looking at history in a very particular way. Yeah. So if I summarize to bring this component to a close, what do we find in the colonial gaze? This is a very special term that we are talking about now in history across the globe: colonization, decolonization, colonial gaze. What do you mean by the colonial gaze? This is what the colonial gaze is about. It's about exoticization. It is about re-articulating local histories through other histories by comparing it to British history, for instance. And then also simplifying things a lot. For instance, the British looked at Sri Lanka as a Buddhist country. They did not go dig deep enough to find that it was much more varied than just a Buddhist country. Even if you talk about Buddhism, it was more varied than the understanding of Buddhism that we have now today, because they were ruling an empire. So for them, India was Hindu. And Ceylon was Buddhist. So that was their simplification and categorization. They did a lot of labeling. And if you really look into the way they went around doing census, the first census was taken in 1810 and started naming people and giving them labels, saying you're Sinhalese, you're Tamil. This whole thing didn't come about. And maybe in that next presentation that you're organizing about maps, you might also hear something about this, how maps, also the cartography of the colonial world, also played a huge role in how we started looking at ourselves and our world. So this is the colonial gaze. The fostering of island mentality, a separate identity from the continent and the region, and the grand narratives, which later on led to very nationalist and sometimes not so helpful framework. Sometimes helpful, sometimes necessary, but sometimes not so helpful extremes that we found ourselves in. So I will sort of stop there and ask if there are any questions, because I want to also know if I'm pitching my what I'm saying is something that you're connecting with, or is it just going above your head? So I'll just stop there and ask if you're all right before moving forward. We can take some questions out of that if you want.
Thank you, Hasini. I think Shihan has a question. Shihan?
Yes, I hope you can see me. It's a bit dark over here. Yes, first of all, thank you for that very interesting introduction. And nice to meet a fellow from Polonnaruwa, because that's where I come from as well. And I know the Institute of Ethnic Studies very well. And you also touched on a few things that I'm grappling with. One is race. Talking of Sri Lanka, how do people see difference? Because jati, vena jati, another kind of person. And I've grappled with the Indian system of varna and jati, desperately trying to understand what these differences are, how rigid or how fluid it was. So how do people in our part of the world, in South Asia, see difference? It's colored by the transatlantic slavery in the West. And that model seems to be imported to our, to South Asia and beyond. So, but I don't feel that people see race. I never saw race.
Sorry, very sorry. I lost you briefly. I got disconnected for some reason. So very sorry. You will have to. I lost you when you started saying the question. So you will have to say it again.
Okay. Yes, because problems of race. I mean,
okay.
In our part of the world, South Asia, including India, how do people view difference? Is it correct the models that we have adopted here in England from the transatlantic slavery, color-based racism, to be taken back to Sri Lanka, where people see difference as kind, jati, and it is not the same as race. So how do they see different? How do you find that they see difference?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. So, even when I was studying in India, when I was studying sociology in India, the first lesson in Indian sociology is caste, for instance, So, what you see across the world as a common thread is that we all have different ways of stratifying or different ways of differentiating people, right? But it's not the same thing everywhere. So race is actually, again, a colonial concept based on the stark skin color difference that you would experience if you meet, if you are from the Eurasian part going to meet people who from Africa or something like that. But if you look at Asia, we had a very different caste system. You have a varna system and a jati system. Yeah. So so this is there are certain elements which are similar to race, which is based predominantly on color, but it's a lot more nuanced and complicated than that. So, for instance, in the Varna system, you do have Varna also means color, difference, so that it is implicit. In Sri Lanka, coming to Sri Lanka, before the colonial period, we did not have the ethnic or racial identity as such, according to sociologists like Professor Tudor, Professor Sasanka, and all of these people, not just me saying it, but we really had a more caste association. We had more regional association in terms of forming identity. For instance, Udarata Pahatarata, where you come from, the region, and the caste, whether you are Govigama, whether you are Karava, was much more important than ethnicity, race, and even language. And you see this, especially when you go to places like the border, so-called border areas where, different languages mix, different cultures mix, like Panama. But then with the colonial experience, we started thinking the same way. For instance, if you today ask me, is there racism in Sri Lanka today? I would say actually yes, because, for instance, look at how we look at skin color. For instance, if you look at what you, how do you, if you look at a film, who is the good guy all the time? Fair guy. I was talking about the same thing yesterday with a friend of mine who is a theater director, who cast the main character the actor was a dark guy. And I said, that's really great, because you always cast a good guy in white. This is completely the Western problem, you know. And come to women, fair skin is like a real issue. You look at the marriage market and see how really ugly this whole black and white thing works out. It's really there. So it wasn't there in the same way before colonial times. We know this because we have names like Kalumanika. You know, this is how you used to call people, because Kalu was beautiful. Kalu was considered beautiful, you know, but now Kalumanika is not a term you would say. You will always call it Sudumanika, right? Sudumanika is what you would. So I think we have, over the years with the colonial experience, learned to take on racism and make it our own system, and infused it with our own systems of caste, for instance, regionalism. And if you look in how things work in Sri Lanka today, you know that all these fault lines, as I call them, social fault lines that are there, they work. Not just caste, but also class, caste, race, ethnicity, all of that now play together, and it's an intermix.
So is it correct to use racism in those countries where race doesn't exist?
Well, I don't know how to really answer that. I think it's not the same thing. So when you call it racism, I think there is a certain level of injustice, because you equal that with what's going on in the West, which is different. So so I don't have a clear answer for that. We have taken certain ideas from the West and fused it with our local systems of hierarchy. So class and caste go together. Into that, we have all the school hierarchies that we create. I mean, it's very different if you are a Thomian, or if you're, you know, the whole way the world reacts to you is very different, because your alliances all depend on these different ways of grouping, social grouping. So to use the word race in Sri Lanka is problematic, I would say. But certain elements of racism is present in Sri Lanka, especially the color divide. For instance, we have the bias that, for instance, this is a word, actually, this is something that was in a Sinhala textbook some time back, which was removed. I will read it. It went on saying, it's in Sinhala, I will say in Sinhala, Harriet Kaluna Sundaraya. Aya Sinhala Kata Kiyimata Dani, right? So Harriet Demala, yeah. So Harriet is Demala person. Harriet Kalu Unat Sundare. So what is the implication there? That means Kalu is ugly, correct? So and this was in a textbook, in the Sinhala textbook way back in the 80s. It's no longer there, thank God. We've come a long way from that. So we do have that, but it's problematic to say that it's the same as what's there in the West, for instance.
Yes, and as to who started the color consciousness, is it the West or is it the East? Because the ancient in the caste system, and when the Portuguese went to India, what did they see?
But I would say it's even longer than that. For instance, if you look at the Varna system in India, you do have the preference for Aryan and white embedded in the Varna system. So to be Tamil Brahmin, for instance, you know, an Indian from that region would know by the skin tone whether you are Tamil Brahmin or not. So if you're Shudras, or if you're untouchable, who are from your very lower caste, you wouldn't be able to tell them by the skin color. So it's, and you know, the caste system in India is 5,000 years old. That's what we believe. So if you really look at the color differences, I think we can go on and on and on, way back to the history of it. Even the Egyptians had it, this kind of color differentiation. So I don't know if one can have the last word on it. It has a long history, because we are very good at creating divisions among ourselves based on the slightest thing, yeah? The human race.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, Mahendra.
Hello, Hasini. A related question is, your answer could be hypothetical and conjectural. I'm trying to wake up in the past in Polonnaruwa and look around me. From what I heard and read, I'm sure that nationhood is a very new concept. If we really go back, people never recognize geographical boundaries and nation as such, especially in solid continents like Europe and so on. If I go back to the Polonnaruwa times and I look around me, I may see dark people, light people, but there's also a difference in language. I might find people who speak Tamil, people who speak Sinhalese. And of course, Tamils tend to be more polarized to the north and the kingdoms in the south, the more Sinhalese, I know that. But there are areas where there are a lot of people living together. How much did language contribute to divide people? And also, is it natural that if you live in a place where people speak two languages, you tend to learn each other's language, won't you, for simply communicating? So I'm just wondering how much of a Sinhala Tamil concept existed in those days, in those areas, in Polonnaruwa and surroundings.
Your question is spot on, and I totally agree with you. That's why I said that it's completely incorrect to use the terms or the labels of Sinhala Tamil on the past, because it didn't definitely exist that way. Even Tamil is not the Tamil that we are referring today. I will show it to you in the presentation. There's an inscription called Velakare script inscription. I'll show it to you. I've got a picture of that, which is just next to the Atadage in Polonnaruwa. And that is written in Tamil Grantha script, which is a particular type of Tamil that existed in 11th century in Sri Lanka. And because we were very, very close to South Indian continent and all of that, we also used that. And that Nisankamal was very, very close to the Pandyans and Cholas and married from there and lived there and all of these stories. So you're very right. And if you really look at Sinhalese, that's actually a different lecture altogether. I would recommend you invite a person like Professor Sirinimal Lakdu Singh, former Director General of the National Museums Department and Colombo National Museum, to talk about this. He has a very interesting interpretation. It's there. He speaks about it in the films that we made of how the Sinhalese Brahmi script changed, evolved over time into the say that, because it's an evolution. You can actually trace Sinhala all the way back to Egyptian hieroglyphs if you want to, right? Because Egyptian hieroglyphs influence the Phoenician alphabet influence the Aramaic alphabet influence the Sanskrit alphabet, then it goes to South Indian alphabets, the North Indian alphabets. We are a mix of the two, so it goes on like that, so you basically trace it back to 5,000 years back very easily, 7,000 years back very easily. And to call one place and say this is where Sinhala became Sinhala is difficult, at least for me. There might be people who are really specializing on the scripts that are able to look at the period and tell you, okay, here now we are beginning to see the modern Sinhala text emerging out of the Brahmi script or the Pahlavi script that was used in Sri Lanka at that time. So, I mean, even using the word Ceylon or Sri Lanka and what was it called, you are absolutely right. The nation concept, the state concept is something that we learned from the West. Even the West started talking about in the 19th and 20th century. It was not there before. That's not how the civilization thought about it. So if you go back to Greek and Roman civilization, in that way, it's not there. So it's history is evolving, and it's always in flux, it's always changing, and that's the nature of history. And to label it and categorize it is a very colonial obsession, by the way. which is why they sort of made museums, because they were able to categorize, periodize, and label them at that time, because they wanted to understand. That was their compulsion to do that. I understand that compulsion too, but that created a lot of problems and a lot of confusion simply by this question that you raised, like, how do you really call it back then? Like, it was not really the case. Yeah? So you're right.
Thank you very much. I mean, my hope is that the study of history, like studying anything, can have pluses and minuses, but I hope the benefit will be to show, especially in Sri Lanka, that continue to divide ourselves as Tamils and Sinhalese and Muslims and so on is not going to help.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
if we can use past history to benefit the future and wake people's eyes and remove paranoia, it will be great help. So I hope that people like you are working can disseminate this information and try to make people realize, more about what humanity is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hasini,
sorry.
I got a question as well for you, and then after that we'll continue with your presentation. With no other hands. So it's directly related to the presentation. Now, the only colonial power which brought the whole of Sri Lanka under their legislation was the English, and that happened in 1815 onwards. So before that, from 1505, the Portuguese and Dutch, they were there. But they were managing the coastal areas, so we cannot attribute the devastation of all the religious and the archaeological sites to any of the Europeans who ruled. Do you have any idea during which period all these monuments in the northwestern province and the east and everywhere became ruined? I know that during the Sitavaka Rajasinghe, was it Sitavaka Rajasinghe? Yeah, he banned Buddhism in the whole country, and there was a he burnt all the Buddhist literature, etc. Was it even predating that, or probably it all started from there?
Again, it depends on which period you're talking about. Like the way you learn about migration of the kingdoms to the southwest. So the way that Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa fell into ruin is very different from the way the eastern provinces would have fallen onto ruin and all of that. And the truth is that we really don't know enough about what happened in the north, for instance. Now, in Jaffna, we don't know anything about the kingdoms of Jaffna and the royal lines of Jaffna. We know we have Sangilian kings. We know the Chakravarti kings were there. Ibn Battuta writes about it in his journals, all of that. But we are very Mahavamsa-centric, so we are not really looking at these other sources to sort of figure out the whole story, So the way that different places fell into rack and ruin are very different reasons. Some of it has been invasions, but some of it has actually been abandoning, just because now I read one of the researchers done on how Polonnaruwa and Anuradhapura abandoned because I'm sorry, I can't remember. He was a British archaeologist who had actually written that. One of the arguments is that after a while the tank system fell into ruin, and that started breeding a lot of mosquitoes, and there was a lot of malaria, and the area became uninhabitable because of that. And then you slowly moved towards another part. That happened in Cambodia too. When I was visiting Cambodia a couple of years ago, this exactly happened in Cambodia with the irrigation system. So whichever the civilizations that sort of achieved high levels of irrigation at some point, when they could not maintain them any longer, that became a burden, and that led to collapse of that irrigation. And it has not just happened in here, happened in Cambodia too. So there are many reasons where that happens. So it's really difficult to pinpoint and say these are the people, because ruining happens not just through conflict and human conflict, but also through time. Time destroys, so that's one. And at least the British, I mean, when they at least discovered Polonnaruwa, Anuradhapura, they did not destroy them. Depending on the kind of relationships that they had, at the beginning they did, because they wanted to dominate. But after they took us under their control, what they did was actually preservation. So, I mean, we have to thank the British also to a certain degree for the kind of work that they have done in terms of excavating sites such as Polonnaruwa, Anuradhapura, and all these amazing photographic work and documentation work that they have done. And you look at the reports that are done by the British, the archaeological surveys, reports that you find in the Colombo National Museum, and you may even find them in the British archives. They are excellent records. The British were fascinating at recording everything. And that's a lot of knowledge left for the next generations. So I wouldn't say that they all they sort of ruined everything. Ruining happened a lot by different people, and we ruin it all the time. Right now, I am working in Vilpattu National Park, and a lot of undiscovered heritage sites in the Vilpattu National Park. They're all looted. So this is all done by people, just normal people, destroy them out of poverty. Politicians destroy them out of greed and superstition, because they believe some kind of nidani can come, and if you get some kind of a sword, they can rule forever, and that kind of superstitions are very much there in our country. So leaders and normal people destroy heritage sites. They are the biggest threat.
Thank you very much, Hasini. Let's continue with the presentation.
Yes. So let's share the thing again. So I want to take you. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes.
Hold on. Now, why can't I go back and forth? One small. Okay. Share screen. Bear with me. Okay, so I want to take you through Polonnaruwa and go through it. So here is a map of Polonnaruwa. We will come back to it at the end. Of course, this is the discovered area of Polonnaruwa. This is what we know of. There's a lot that we still haven't excavated. We still don't know. But you do know that if you go to Polonnaruwa, we have the archaeological site, which is where you see the biggest concentration. You can see the Satmahal Prasada here, Atadage, stone, all of the Dalada Maliga, all of these, and then the Garnadevi Kovil, all of that, and all the way up to Galvihara here. So this stretch is the main archaeological site of Polonnaruwa at the moment, what we know of it right now, what is excavated and what is restored. There's a lot more further down that is not quite in this map, and a lot more that we haven't discovered naturally. So when we talk about Polonnaruwa right now, the way, for instance, the tourist board would represent it, you say Polonnaruwa and Galvihara comes to the mind, and that is wonderful, because it's really an amazing, mind-blowing work of art. But what I find problematic is not the fact that we appreciate and give the due prominence to Galvihara, but the fact that we read it very superficially and don't give also what is lying around it. That is, for me, what I'm trying to sort of get at. For instance, if you look at even the Galvihara statues, we know by the existence of Makara Torana that you can see behind this figure right now, and the Vimanas that you can call them, the little houses that you can see on top in this photograph. These are the Vimanas. All of this actually speaks of a very different type of Buddhism than the Buddhism that we know of. So even when we say Sri Lanka was a Buddhist country, or whatever we call the island at that time was a Buddhist country, that is also simplifying certain things to a huge degree. What type of Buddhism is very important. For instance, you know the British Museum houses Tara. Do we worship Tara right now in Theravada? No. How on earth did we have so many Bodhisattva statues coming out of Sri Lanka? The Bodhisattva Avalokiteswara, Amitabha, all of these Bodhisattvas, the Tara worship. This is not a part of Theravada Buddhism that's currently in the country at the moment. It's a very different type of Buddhism. So actually, the Galvihara also speaks to that. If you are an art historian who's able to tell you by the Makara figures that you see, have you seen these types of Makara figures you would have seen in China also, on the East Asian part, for instance, because that's the link. It's a different type of Buddhism that existed. So, of course, we do have what we consider pure Buddhist architecture, very similar to what you would get in Egypt, the pyramids. It's simple, it's beautiful architecturally, it's a masterpiece. That we have to acknowledge. It's beautiful in that sense. And here, but already now, this, for instance, is the area called the Sacred Quadrangle in the Polonnaruwa archaeological site, which has a high concentration of different buildings. So what you see, the circular one is the Vatadagi, the famous one that we see. And this triangular building here is called the Satmahal Prasad. Now, this building is a very unique type of building architecturally. We don't find that anywhere else in Sri Lanka. And a lot of archaeologists or art historians cannot really explain to you where did they come from. Okay, you can, if you put Sri Lanka in context of the region. Where do you find these kinds of things? You find them very easily in Cambodia, Angkor Wat, and Siem Reap, and all of these places like Baksa Chamkrong, Thailand, you have it. So all these East Asian countries. You also have it, of course, in Latin America. But I mean, of course, Latin America is a far-fetched idea. So we do know that probably this is an influence from, or not really an influence. This supports the argument that we were connected to the rest of the region, Asia region, and we drew inspiration from other types of architectures that were around. Yeah. So this here, I will go, yeah. So this is the inscription that I was talking about, Velakkara inscription, when Mahendra was talking about scripts and how Sinhala became Sinhala, Tamil became Tamil. Now, this is an interesting story. For instance, this Atadage, we attribute to the king Nissankamalla. And popularly, we say that Nissankamalla is the king who said, to become a king in Sri Lanka or that island at that time, you need to be a Buddhist. Yeah, and Atadage here was the building that he built to keep the sacred tooth relic there. So that was Dalada Maligawa in 11th century Polonnaruwa, what you are looking at right now. But the inscription beside this here, this one, here is a closer look at it. Sorry if you can you see it clearly? I hope you can see it clearly. The inscription, this is called Tamil Grantha script, and we do know the army that protected the Dalada Maligawa were Tamil Velakkarais, because they were a merchant army, and like in South Asia, kings could borrow armies to support you. So if you pay, you would get your army to protect. So actually in 11th century Polonnaruwa, the Dalada Maligawa and the temple of the tooth relic was protected by a merchant army, a Tamil merchant army. And the fact that the inscription is in Tamil Grantha script usually says, I mean, which language would you put in an official document right now? It says basically is simply the language of power at the time. So this is very, very easy to see. It's there. Nobody's nobody's setting this up. It's right there for you to see. And even now I don't have a picture of Galpotha. You all know Galpotha. Even the advertisement about this lecture that was circulated had the Galpotha and had that Gaja Lakshmi symbol. The worship of Lakshmi was in Polonnaruwa very easy. So you know that. So here we are coming to a place already which is very mixed. So this is the building that I told you, Satmahal Prasad. You will see it if you go to Polonnaruwa. We can't really, it's not really a local architecture. This is definitely due to our links with Southeast Asian architects or Asian artists, for instance. And then, this is as you enter, this is Sivadevala number 1, for instance. This is very, very close to the Vaijayantha Prasada, which is the palace of the king. And right behind this is Vatadage, the sacred quadrangle, and the Vatadage, and where the Dalada Maligav and all of that was. So you see that within the complex, you see how close in proximity the Hindu Kovil and the Buddhist temple were. So for us, it's like, wow, because we are bringing in these words like Hindu and Buddhist into our discussion. That's why we say, wow. For them, it was normal. We also know that all Sinhala kings married, most of Sinhala kings married South Indian princesses for the dynasty. So there is really no way of calling anybody Sinhalese in that way, right? So if there was ever a fight for power between different brothers for the throne, the one who is weakest would run away to India to your uncles for support and come back with an army backed by your uncle, because your mother's brother was obviously in India. So this is family, So it's really not that easy to call it Sinhala kings. Even Nisankamal is like that, right? I mean, so this is Sivadevala number 2. But of course, now this period, these Sivadevalas are from an interesting period, because this is another period of history where we were a part of an empire, a colonial empire. So when we talk about colonial empires, we start with the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British. But in 11th century, the Chola dynasty of southern India had a huge empire that spread from South India, included the north of the island of Sri Lanka, all the way up to Bali. That's why you get all these Hindu architectures in Bali, the temples and Hindu stuff in Bali, Cambodia, Indonesia, all of that. So that was a huge empire, and we were part of that empire. And these were actually attributed to the king Raja Chola and Rajendra Chola, who was his son. And he did not ever actually come to Sri Lanka, but he had a lot of armies living in the island. And they obviously built this. And these were also used by the wives of the kings. The kings who sort of also came after the Chola rulers continued worshipping these places. And in fact, the Sivadevala number 2 is today, if you go today is also worshipped by Buddhists and Tamil people together. So the worshipping continues. These are living sites, just like Galvihar. It's a living site. This is the particular thing. It's not a dead site. We still go there, and these are still sacred sites where we, burn incense and light lamps and say our prayers and chantings, etc. And this is the Vishnu Kovil that is in there, in the middle of all the Lanka Tilaka, all the Buddhist that I'm now just showing you the Tamil ones. Now here is a Siva temple number 5, which is also known as Naipena Vihara. Right? So here is a classic example of how the same site changes identities and the category of devotees after time. So what you see here is very clearly a Sivalinga in the middle. If you go there, I've seen rituals and Tamil people still coming here and doing their rituals here. But Naipena Vihara is a Buddhist temple. So this is a site that's both Tamil, Hindu, and also a Buddhist temple, because of the Naipena, it's not here, but there's a Naipena, a cobra head, which is there. And because of that, it's called Naipena Vihara. and the Buddhists also came to the site. So you can see that these identity markers are very blurred. So people really did not at that level care whether it is Hindu or Buddhist. The site was sacred and you go and you pray, So here is a very good example of a syncretic place of worship that has been Hindu, Buddhist throughout times and even today. And now this is the discoveries of archaeological department in 1960s. The first lot of bronzes were discovered in 1907 under HCP Bell, and they are all kept at the Colombo National Museum. And this was actually done by our own archaeologists such as Godakumbura way back in 1960s. Way after that, and they are in the Polonnaruwa Museum. And these are all statues of Parvati and Siva and Nataraja and all of that. So the next session is going to be, I'm going to go into the archaeological museum. So what we see into the archaeological museum is interpretation, right? So what I showed you so far is if you walk through archaeological complex, this is what you would see. It's all mixed. You see a temple here, next to it is a Hindu kovil, and this is here, this is that. It's all mixed. And then you go to the museum. You go to the archaeological museum. You enter. You have these galleries of Buddha statues and Bodhisattva statue. Of course, at the end you can see it. A lot of Buddha statues. And if you look at the gallery plan, you have all of these gallery 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 6. Basically talks about Polonnaruwa as if it's a Buddhist kingdom, and then gallery 7 has Hindu monuments. That's where all the Parvatis and Siva and all of that. Now, if you look at the site, that division is not there in the actual site. That division is there in the museum, right? So this for me is the colonial gaze, because the colonial people started putting that. And we also know that museums are also colonial projects. So when we start representing our past, we start representing it through the categories and bronzes. I would put them right up there in the front gallery at the when you enter the museum, because they're so beautiful. Look at this Siva Nataraja. Instead of that, they are at the last gallery. Hindu monuments, really not connected to the rest of the story. Gallery 1 to 6 completely talks about a total different story. So what is the interpretation here? The focus on kings and the Buddhist monks of Polonnaruwa is very much there throughout. I've read all the notes because this was my research for the book Museums, Memory and Identity Politics in Sri Lanka. So I read a lot of the notices that are there, the key messages, and I've taken more Sinhalese Buddhist perspective. And while the Tamil identity is acknowledged, it's always kind of marginal. The last gallery remains loosely connected to the rest of the descriptions. So it's not the main story, it's a peripheral story. It's a by the way story. It's an anecdote, not the main story. So this is the problem of interpretation and representation that I'm seeing right now. And that it has contributed hugely to the identity politics and the conflicts that we've been experiencing for the last, since independence, I would say. Yeah, so before I go into an alternative representation, I want to just stop there and also ask if there are further questions, because the next would be the last section. And I don't know how you are doing with time. It's taking a long time. I can also skip it if you feel that's enough for you. You're welcome to guide me on that one.
Yeah, you're fine. You're fine. Yeah. Let's go for some questions if there are any. I can't see any hands.
I raised my hand.
Lakshmi, yeah, go for it. Thank you.
It's a very informative talk, and I actually very interesting and very, I was listening to it very carefully. What about the present modern museum in Polonnaruwa? How does that contribute to your research, and do you think that they are represented well enough according to you?
Yeah, so at the moment, there are two big museums in Polonnaruwa. The one that I'm showing you here is the Archaeological Museum, run by the Department of Archaeology. There's another museum that was opened recently. Yeah, back in 2019. Yes, by Maitripal Sirisena. Absolutely correct. That is called Museum of Ancient Technology in Polonnaruwa. So it's not per se about Polonnaruwa, it's about ancient technology as a whole. So you are also presenting how way back in prehistory, during the Batadurbalena caves and all of that, how we made red pottery shards and all of that. So it's not particularly talking only about Polonnaruwa. There's a little bit about Polonnaruwa, but it's really focusing a lot more on ancient technology. So, and then there is also, I don't know how that is related. There's a gallery of political figures there, which is like a wax.
Madame Tussauds.
Well, see, this is the problem. This is the politics of museum making.
Yeah, they have, I mean, it's a lot of money.
Yes.
And, you can see hours and hours. I mean, you can spend the hours and hours.
Yeah.
And, I mean, different types of rice and different types of letters, Sri Lankan letters, lots of information, but I don't know how one connects to the other, you know.
Yes, exactly. So that's also what I found in my museum research, because I sort of tried to evaluate all of them for narrative strength, and that is about the messaging, the communication. So when a student or anybody for that matter enters inside a museum and goes through the galleries and comes out, what is the key message that person is taking? What is the vision? Because museums are places where people go for inspiration. Muse comes from, the word muse comes from inspiration. Museums are places where we go to think about our future, not just about our past, you know, where we take lessons from our past for the future. So that is really important in terms of what is your vision, what are your key messages, and that is really about curation and narrative strength within a museum. We across the board, we score very low in that. Sri Lankan museums score very low in that because we still have a very old-fashioned katuge concept of museums where we don't tell stories. We are just holding objects and putting them on display and saying, oh, this is great, that is great, but one doesn't really connect to the other. So it's exactly what you just said, because it's very difficult for you to make sense or meaning out of that. You know that if you now visit a museum in the West, they tell you stories, you know.
It's not evidence, like resource-sourced evidence.
Yes.
Unlike in British museums where things are like evidence that are the resources for public.
I mean, on the other hand, that museum at least has some new technologies incorporated. So you're using audio visuals. At least when I went, the touch screens were still working. You know, I mean, sometimes they just fall into disrepair. And
you could mold a Buddha statue by doing some gadgetry things, and
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, this is not modernizing a museum. That's the idea that a lot of museum people in Sri Lanka get when you say modernizing the museum. It's all about including touch screens. And they say, oh, no, we don't have money. I say, no, this is not about putting touch screens inside a museum. That's not modernization. It's about looking at how you are displaying, how you are bringing out the stories behind objects. What is the story that you want to tell through these objects, through the exhibition that you're presenting to the audience? What are your education programs? This is not this does not cost money. This just takes people, bright people, well-trained people to guide through a museum. You know, this takes educators, museum educators, not just tourist guides.
Like in Cairo, isn't it? The museum.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, Devinder.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Hasini, Haputhantri. You are excellent. Thank you so much for the talk. And
Thank you.
your talk is very analytical, very persuasive. I hope you're going to continue doing this for a long time because much needed. Thank you. Is the establishment, the archaeology, have bought into your argument of actually there is a desperate need to change how we curate the museums, because it's actually will really change how we perceive ourselves and particularly the identity politics?
So I have good news and bad news. If I tell you the good news, it's just that since I did my museology course back in 2015, and when I came back to the country, there was nobody who was talking about museums back then. But today, there's a huge momentum in the field. For instance, new museums are coming out. We are now setting about establishing a museum of modern art, for instance, in Colombo, a completely non-state initiative that's backed by the corporates. There are lots of good people trained abroad coming and working for it. So many people, so many new students have contacted me saying that they're doing their PhD thesis or master thesis on museology. So I'm so very, very glad to see the kind of momentum that it has gained over a tract of 2015 to right now. Because back then I was the lone voice and people just asked me, is that really a field of study? What is museology? And that's why I stopped calling myself a sociologist and started calling myself a museologist, so that I get an opportunity to explain to people what museology is. So that's the good news. There's a lot of new momentum and new energy coming from outside the state sector, and I welcome that. But coming back to the state sector, it's very not too good news really for me, because the problem is, if you look at museums in England, for instance, British Museum, it's more powerful than the Parliament. The Parliament would say, return the artifacts. The British Museum will say no, because the museum is very independent by itself. Sri Lanka museums are not that. They are all part of a state structure. And even the way they are manned is so different. Now, for instance, when I went back and talked to the director of the museum, Colombo National Museum, I just went and said, look, I've learned all this, and I was, it was a scholarship. I learned all of it for free. I feel indebted that I come back and train you and pass this knowledge. So just, you don't have to pay me nothing. I will come and train your educators to do these kinds of guided tours and educational programs, etc. And the director says, well, there's no point, because in another year or two, they will get to change to the Ministry of Sports or Ministry of Irrigation or Ministry of Information Science, right? So the staff of the museum is not permanent. Like, how do you run a museum like that? You can't, right? The second thing, the museums are really profit-making organizations right now. They are hugely visited. I can show you figures of how many people visit the Colombo National Museum, Polonnaruwa. They are hugely profitable, these institutions, but they don't get the profit to maintain themselves. All of that goes back to the central treasury. So the fact that the museums are part of the bigger administrative system, state administrative system, is number one problem for museums in Sri Lanka at the moment. Because then the museum has all the problems that every other state department in Sri Lanka has. All the problems that every other state department has, the museum has, and even more on top of it, because you can't run a specialized, highly specialized scientific institute like a museum through people who change every two years. So I mean, one or two people will be long serving, but the others change. For instance, the Department of Archaeology has about 27 museums under them, and there is still, the last time I checked, there was no head for museums, no head of the museums field, vacancies filled, because it's a state structure. They can't hire from outside. You have to come through the system. You have to be a state employee, and there's politics inside that. So nobody gets the post has been vacant for for about like last 5 years. There is no head of the department of head of museums for the Department of Archaeology, which runs 27 museums in the country. So that is the big problem with the museums in Sri Lanka. So, I mean, my contribution towards this is that I speak in forums like this. I try to educate people to show how our museums managed in Sri Lanka, how our museums managed elsewhere, what we should do. And in a way, I feel that we need to work on both ends, trying to change the way that the state museums are run, which is a long run, it's a long haul. And by the other way, also encouraging new initiatives, corporate sector initiatives that gives the independence to run a museum. You know, have a board of directors, chairman, and different way of governing a museum, etc., which is much more freer. So I feel that we have to work on both scales to change the museum situation right now. So it's good news and bad news.
Is there an opportunity for you to strike a relationship with the private sector then? Because like what happened in America, where Carnegie, all these amazing sites has come because of philanthropists pouring in money. So is there opportunity, because you are well versed, I think you might be so suitable to run a museum. Is there opportunity?
Well, I mean, I'm part of several initiatives that are working on museum attempts, and museums are not 1 year project. Every museum is about 5 to 10 year establishment period. I mean, all these museums that we are looking at, they take a long time to set up, and they will last for generations, hundreds to hundreds of years. So you can't make it overnight. So I'm part of slightly 2 initiatives. There's a mobile museum initiative that I'm a part of. I'm working with. Then there's a modern art museum effort that I'm a part of. I'm working with a lot of other very, very good people who are trying to work hard. But the problem is, you can do a museum on modern art because modern art is not under state sector. The state doesn't consider modern art as important anymore, so you can. But if you really go into setting up museums about Polonnaruwa, for instance, or Anuradhapura, for instance, this is where it becomes very difficult for the private sector to work, because these are completely under the Ministry of Culture, Department of Archaeology, and Department of National Museums, or the Central Cultural Fund. So no one can actually go in there, and it's not very easy for the private sector to go into these areas, because these heritage sites come directly under the state control. And fighting that is a very hard battle. It's the same with the education sector. I mean, you look at government universities, you look at government schools, the battle is very long and hard. And it's so very centralized, it's very difficult to work there. And actually, people are very nice. Like I work very closely with the Colombo National Museum, and the directress is a very nice person. The education officer is a very nice person. So personally, they are all fine people. The former director, Professor Lagdup Singh, is a brilliant scholar and amazing people. But you put them in those institutions which are very colonial in their setup, they can't really do much in that system. So that's the problem.
Thank you so much for taking all these steps, though. Thank you. And thank you for coming to speak to us.
Yeah.
Okay, I believe, Tamara, you have a comment to make?
Yeah. Thank you for the fantastic presentation. I just remembered that we had a presentation by Dr. Kamani Tennakon, who is a professor of, I can't remember exactly, in the genetics department, shall we say, of Colombo University. And she presented her study where she concluded that in the samples she has studied, the genetic composition between the Sri Lankan Tamils and Sinhalese were quite similar than they were with the Muslim people, who have come from the Middle East as traders to start with. So I think it's time for us to have very community-friendly history books, history textbooks, where such facts are, such facts should be clear, so that we would understand with each successive international marriage between a Sinhalese king and a South Indian princess. So things have become quite mixed, so that we would try to celebrate it rather than saying that we are different. Thank you.
Absolutely. I agree with you on one point. That is, I mean, not just that that we married South Indian princesses, but all these kings also had sisters that they exported everywhere. Now, for instance, I found that in Cambodia, Jayavarman, King Jayavarman, who is their biggest, the celebrity king there in Cambodia, he had among in his, a Sri Lankan princess. So we also, I mean, this is the regional network of connections that we lived in. And in terms of being hybrid, I think we, one thing that we are not really focusing on right now is that the island has been in the world system for a long time, from 2nd century BCE, because of being in the middle of Silk Route. So it was so much a hub of trade, etc. And so many people came in. That is where I don't, I don't know if Kamani said it exactly the same way. That is where I wouldn't agree that the Middle Eastern people came here as invaders. They did not, actually. It was the colonials who came as invaders, but all the Arabian people came as traders. They came here and they married in here, because that's what the Muslim traders did all the time, because they were traders, so they did not come as invaders. They did not come with guns. Guns came later with the Portuguese and the Dutch. They came in and married and settled into the country, and they built their mosques and propagated them. That's how it happened. But also, when you talk about the Muslim community in Sri Lanka, a lot of people look to the Middle East. But that is also a misconception. Now, for instance, if you look at the work of Professor Sasanka Perera, I'm not an expert of that, but he has done quite a bit of work. The Muslim community in Sri Lanka is predominantly not from Middle East, it's from South India. So it's the Indian Muslim line that we are more connected to than the Middle Eastern one. Although even the Muslim community in Sri Lanka would like to, again, superiority in creative complexes. We would like to align ourselves more with the Middle East, but that's not really the case. Our line is more connection to the Indian Muslim communities, and even the language of use and all of that is more in line with the Indians. So the Muslims did not come as invaders; they came as traders. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't say Muslims came as invaders. I said as traders. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. My mistake. Because this has been, I have heard this so many times in when I'm working with students. So I immediately connected that. So my bad, totally. But I had heard that comment so many times, so I immediately sort of also heard it as that. Sorry for that. Yeah.
Fine.
You're right.
Thank you.
Shihan, you got a question?
Yes, since you mentioned hybrid, it occurred to me, when do we think of people in terms of hybrid, like mestizos, metissas, which we call in Sinhala?
There's a lot of genetic research in terms of hybridity, and we are obsessed to the limit of saying, oh, my DNA has to be from two different things to make me hybrid. For me, this is really a little bit getting the wrong end of the stick in a way. Okay, it's there. That's science, but for me, hybridity is in the culture that I live in. I mean, there is so much hybridity in our faith, so much in what we eat, so much in our language. Look at all the Sinhala, the word. Now, for instance, Dalada Maligav, very good example. Dalada Maligav. Maligawa comes from the Tamil word Malikai, right? Pirit Noola, very Buddhist, Noola. Noola comes from the Tamil word Noor, right? Sinhala Kodiya or Jatika Kodiya. Kodi comes from the Tamil word Kodi. Somebody who is into culture studies, as a sociologist, as an anthropologist, I look more towards this because this is where you see the richness and the beauty of hybridity. And for me, it's absolutely who we are. And even more than really going and looking, tracing my genetic code, I think is like, I mean, obviously, because there's no human race that can be not mixed, because people have been migrating always, forever across the globe. It's just, again, colonial thinking to think that, people started building ships and going around in the 1500s. No, people traveled all over the world before that. From 2nd century BCE, we know we are mentioned in map of Eratosthenes, who lived in Alexandria in Egypt, in 2nd century BC. So we know that people traveled all over the world, and wherever people went, they were married.
Yeah. Sorry, no, but I meant hybridity in people. How did I meant when a Malay married a Sinhalese or an Arab married a Sinhalese, Sri Lankan, there is not so much differentiation until maybe it's colonial writing, where it's written, the Metissa comes. But then if you look before that, the Muslims did the same. But it's interesting, it's interpreted into loyalty. When it comes to the army, it's the Laskarins and the half Portuguese are more loyal. The Arabs did the same. The Arabs who married the Indians and the children of them were considered more loyal than Indians. So they were sought after. So it gets interpreted. But otherwise, we lived in harmony, as you said. Without thinking of those barriers.
Yeah. I mean, people married, so a lot of that hybridity came out of alliances. A lot of the people who came were all men. Men took into the ships. And then they always married from wherever they went. So that hybridity really came. But like you say, where it starts becoming politicized is when the power dynamics start happening. Then you start putting, okay, if you are this degree dark, you are on this state. If you are slightly lighter, then you are on mestizo is a higher rate. In South Africa, you have this horrible system of color grading that according to which brown or how dark or light your skin color is, you are given a status in terms of how you have mixed. So your pedigree becomes important, your genetic code becomes important, and all of that. So this is when power comes into the discussion. Apart from that, I think it's exactly what you said. People married, people behaved like normal human beings anyway behave. And also culture is also the same. Wherever you went, you started learning. I mean, we go to a different country, we start learning the language. It's natural, we want to communicate. So this hybridity is an inevitable process that happens in human civilizations.
Yes, and also from the Sri Lankan point of view, I get the impression that colonial is putting all the three colonial powers into one block, and also the British are dominating because we speak English. They left our histories. Our elite were educated in English around independence. So that is also not, it's coloring our thinking. And also the Portuguese, they came in as traders, not as invaders. And they were, pulled into the local politics. And then they begin to colonize and they don't want to go. And because they were driven out after a 20-year war by the Dutch, they didn't leave any histories that influence our thinking today. So they didn't represent us or interpret us or misinterpret us. So there is that kind of spectrum to be looked at in our colonial history. If you are going to draw the lines between colonial and pre-colonial and independence, then there's variation in between.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I totally agree. And that's why I think that, I mean, some people say, okay, why do you want to go so much back into the past? Like it's past and it's gone. But for me, this is why it's so important to revisit the experience of colonization, because I don't think we have interpreted it correctly by exactly what you are pointing out right now, Shihan, because we just put it into one simplistic category and say, okay, it's bad. You know, no, it's not just bad, and it's not just British. It's a lot of things happen there. And we need to understand the nuances to understand who we are today. So that's why I really, really like this topic of colonization, and also especially to do it in tandem or in dialogue with the West, with the British archaeologists or British historians. That's what's really important for us to do right now.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on with your presentation, Hasini.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Yeah, let me try to share the screen again. Okay. Okay, again I get, okay. So in this book that that just came out of press last week, the Shared Sanctity book, what I did was like really trying to write not in terms of academic language. You know, I mean, I always think when I walk inside the International Center for Ethnic Studies, is a beautiful library, and I always think all the problems and issues that Sri Lanka has, all the answers are there inside that little room, that little library, but nobody really reads them, you know. So because this is the problem between the division between academia and the rest of the world. And for me, what I said when International Center ICS actually asked me, can you do something on it? And I told them, I don't want to write research articles on it. I want to write articles that normal people read, and I want to write travelogues out of them. And I sort of went and studied this site, which for me, like, it was a wow moment for me to realize what was happening in Tivanka Image House. So I don't know how familiar you are with that. If I go back to the little map, a lot of people skip Tivanka Image House. It's right there on the edge. It's further up from Galvihar. A lot of people will go all the way up to Galvihar and then they turn around, they go. Beyond that is that Lotus Pole, and further up, Lotus Pond, and even in the map you will see that it's not easy to see it. It's really way on the margins of our imagination, Tivanka Image House. It's really not the center. It's really the margin of our imagination. And for me, somehow, you know, when I went to that site, that has a beautiful, it's really a beautiful romantic site that I connected at a very soul level. I don't know why. And it turns out that it has really beautiful classical painting, the remaining classical paintings that we have of that period. No other building really has paintings, actual paintings from Polonnaruwa period, except Tivanka Image House. So this is actually the image of how Joseph Lawton, the guy, this photographer that I studied about, who went and documented it. This is also one of his captures, how it came out. You know, now we have, it doesn't look this romantic anymore because we've just really sort of excavated it and preserved it. I mean, which we must do because otherwise we will lose all the paintings. And this site, I want to show you how it's really made. So like the exterior of the site that you are seeing here, you can see these little houses, like there are multiple stories. These are called vimanas. You know, architecturally, they're called vimanas. Art historians call them vimanas. So vimanas is a concept of hierarchy in the celestial sphere, and it actually comes not so much from Buddhist Theravada Buddhist concept, but Mahayana Buddhist concept, which is also very close to Hinduism. You know, Hinduism has 33,000 gods, right? There you have a hierarchy. So the vimanas, or the imagining of heaven as a stratified sphere, is the depiction, what is depicted through vimanas here. This is what we see, right? So if you now see a Gopuram of a Hindu Kovil, you will see the Vimanas, one on top of the other, the gods are, piled on top of the other like a little pyramid. So that is a concept that you see here from the outside. So you can see, and also, although what we see today is a exposed brick building, if you can notice here, there's a tiny little bit of painting that is left in the middle of this, at the top of this here. There's a little bit of painting that's left, which means actually the original building back in the, I mean, there's of course not an original building, it was reconstructed several times, but like, at that time in Polonnaruwa, 11th century at least, was probably painted like what a Hindu Kovil would look like right now. See, you have the Devatas, these are the Devata figures, and Bodhisattva figures. And again, I told you before, Bodhisattva is a direct hint at Mahayana Buddhist connection than Theravada sphere. And you have all these beautiful dwarf figures that Roland Ravenheart, another colonial writer who writes beautifully, actually, you must read some of their literature. Sometimes these colonial, they write beautifully, their language is beautiful. Their colonial gaze, we must take with a pinch of salt and be analytical enough to put things in, understand in context, but they write beautifully. He writes about these dwarves a lot and how merry they are, the merry dwarves, he calls them, so it's a building that has life still in it. And then you walk inside and you see all these beautiful paintings. And now all these paintings are from Jataka tales. That is Buddhist, And this particular painting is a Jataka tale called Asankavati Jataka, which, by the way, doesn't come in the Pansiya Panas Jataka Pota, the 555 Jataka tales that we are familiar with. It comes from this book called Jataka Mala, which is more the Tibetan Buddhist or the North Indian Buddhist version of it. So here we find this in it, Asankavati Jataka. And this I cannot actually see here. I've forgotten what this is. I knew all the Jatakas that were painted here. I'm just sharing them to show you how beautiful they are. And this is this beautiful painting called The Divine Invitation, where the gods are asking the Bodhisattva to leave the heavenly abode and be born as the Buddha in the mortal world. And this is what gets often compared with the Ajanta cave paintings, because according to art historians, Ajanta cave paintings also have this very strong outer line. Can you see how well defined the outer line here? If you see the eyebrows, the eyes, the shape of the arms and all of that, right? So this is all outer line, is very strong, and that's a tradition that is very much associated with the continental art schools of Ajanta, Ellora, and also Karnataka in South India. We know Rajendra Chola and Rajaraja Chola's, some of the paintings attributed to them, they have the same style of painting, which today professors like art historians and archaeologists like Professor Senaka Bandaranaike attribute as medieval classical paintings in the country. So all of this actually tells you, if you know how to read the architecture, if you know how to read the art, it shows you how connected we are with the rest of the region, with the rest of the world, that we were never an island that is alone somewhere out there in the sea, So that's what I say. This is called the Maitri Balajataka, again, one of the better preserved ones. It's fast. We are losing them very, very fast due to salt efflorescence, it's called, because of thing. This is the Themiya Jataka here. This is also Themiya Jataka, I think. Again, Themiya Jataka, carrot here. So now, for instance, go back to the times of Polonnaruwa. All these, that's why in my article, I called it Temple as Museum, Religion as Art, because these were the museums of our past. The temple was a museum. We didn't have separate museums because the temple housed the art. The temple was the gallery that you would go into. And today, everybody who goes inside modern museums says, I can't understand modern art naturally, because you don't have the background. Now, for instance, imagine you are living in 11th century. You go inside Tivanka Image House, and you go with your parent or your grandfather. They would have already told you what the Semya Jataka is. So you see it and you immediately understand who is the character, what is happening there. So it's like watching Netflix here, So you see that all of these stories are narratives. You also see that in Egyptian art. You go inside a pyramid, it tells a story. All the hieroglyphs, all the Egyptian art will tell a story. And the people who lived at that time knew the story to sort of read these things. I mean, fortunately, because we know some of these Jataka tales, we can also understand and read, and art historians will also help us understand how this is connected, how to read their style, their coloring, all of that, and put that in context. So here is the caveat of my argument here. Now look at the Tivanka Image House ground plan. You know that Tivanka, an image house, is obviously a house or a religious space built to worship an image. And what is the image of? Here, of course, it is a Buddha image. You take the ground plan of Tivanka Image House. You have the entrance, you have the vestibule here, you have an Antarala where the beautiful divine invitation paintings are, and then you have the sanctum sanctorum where the thing is. Now, if you really look at the ground plan of a Hindu kovil, it's absolutely the same. It's absolutely the same. So this is what this is my aha moment in Tivanka Image House, is that you walk into the Polonnaruwa Museum and you so easily separate the Hindu from the Buddhist. You walk into Tivanka Image House, you really can't separate that. What do you call this ground plan? Is it a Buddhist ground plan or is it a Hindu ground plan? Is it inside is all Buddhist tales, outside it is all Hindu cosmic interpretations of Vimanas and gods and goddesses. So is this building a Hindu building or is this building a Buddhist building? So for me, this is the essence of Polonnaruwa, and this is why I love this site so much. Simply because here you begin to see, like Shihan was pointing out, this whole concept of hybridity or syncretism or fusion or confluence or whatever the technical term you want to call it, is it's completely useless to approach it from a point of categorizing or labeling it, because it's one. It's really one. You can't really give it a label. Apart from saying that it is a sacred space where people came and worshipped and they appreciated the art, and some of the art was even like, you would look at it and they are like, some of it is more violent than a Netflix movie these days, because there is cannibalism depicted, there is infidelity depicted, there is all kinds of human drama depicted through these Jataka tales. Are very colorful. But unfortunately, I don't have time to go into some of the details of it. But I do invite you next time you're in Polonnaruwa, go and visit Tivanka Image House. It's beautiful. It's a feast to the eye. So here, not just Tivanka Image House, this is Lankatilaka, which is a little bit further up. Further down in the site, which also has Vimana carvings. You know that Lankatilaka is a Buddhist image house, but you have exterior, you have the Vimana carvings out there. So for me, the concluding questions of all the takeaway for this is like, the issue is about how we understand, name, frame, label the past. The point is that we often do it by the categories that we know now. And for me, this is highly problematic, to label past or categorize past or represent past by using the labels that we know now, whether it's Sinhalese or Buddhist or I don't know, whatever the labels that you want to go ahead with. And the question is like, how do we represent an inclusive history for our future generation? How do we contextualize it in colonial historiography? How do we contextualize it in nationalist historiography that we have been experiencing for the past 70 years? How do we contextualize it in our present circumstances, where we are right now? So these are the kind of questions that I want to sort of raise with the audiences that I'm engaging with, whether they are academics or just normal people or students or university students or teachers or whoever. Yeah, and I just feel that these sites would tell you so much if we only knew how to read these details, because it's there on plain sight, but because we lack the knowledge to read them, because we've lost the knowledge systems through which we can read them, we cannot read the clues that's out there. So I would just stop there and open up. That's the end.
Thank you so very much, Hasini. Let's see what questions come from the audience. Let me put to the gallery view. I can't see anybody. Oh yeah, Chaya. Chaya, you want to ask the question, please? You can put on your video as well so that people.
No, sorry, Ruan. I was just sending a clapping sign. Thank you so much, Hasini. It was really, really, really excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Mahendra.
Hello, Hasini. I was just going to make a general point about how human beings make decisions and form opinions. I think it's been found over and over again that quite often a group of people or person forms an idea based on various influences in his or her life or history. And once that opinion is formed, then they scan for evidence to support that view.
Mm.
This is happening in religion very often, and also in history and in politics. And that is the challenge people like you have, so that you can say, look, these are the facts as I see them, and interpreted, not interpreted, but as seen. Is not my interpretation suit my own opinion. These are the facts. But trouble is, people who delve into history quite often are looking for evidence to support an opinion which is already formed. And this is true in religion also. So people are very proud to say, oh, do you know that the Bible definitely supports evolution? Or do you know that Buddhism definitely supports quantum theory? So in other words, people form an opinion and then they look for evidence. So what the difficulty we have now is to convince people that they should not start with an opinion, but look for facts and then try and interpret them in a truthful way, not to suit your own agenda. I think that will remain a human problem throughout. I don't have a solution for that.
Thank you. That was a very, very thoughtful remark on your side, because I relate to it. I remember being a part of, forum of history educators, and one of the problems that we were discussing about, and this was again not just Sri Lanka, but like, you know, there were South African historians, Lebanese historians everywhere. One of the things that they came up again and again and again, we can be very rational about science. When it comes to history, we are very, very irrational. We are very emotional, right? So that is a dilemma of history, because it's a part of you, because it's directly connected to defining who you are and your identity. It's very subjective. So it's very, very difficult to invite people to look at things and say, you know, here are things, look at them, and what do you see? You know, because their monocles are already formed, like you were saying, you know, their glasses are already formed, their opinions are already formed, and it's very, I mean, in that work that we did to bring together university students from Jaffna and Colombo universities together to go and visit Polonnaruwa and read all of that. It was very difficult for these young students to do. They're not even old, they're very young. But even by the time that you are like 18, you have become so attached to a certain narrative of your history, and you're so emotional about it. and you believe that that's exactly the truth and nothing else is truth. So it's very difficult to change people, and but that's what I also find as fascinating work. You are trying to make them unlearn fundamental period of socialization. You absorb it through your family, your school, and also through media. I mean, films are full of history. I mean, history is our favorite genre when it comes to TV and films. So this is very difficult arena.
Thank you very much. I mean, most people say the past has happened and you can't change it. The trouble is we don't know exactly what the past is.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to Shihan.
Hello, Rohan, thank you very much for the question. This was a fascinating discussion. I was enthralled by it. But one question now, which I like to ask, also connected to what you just said a few minutes ago about rationality. One fact which we have been told and which is taken for granted historically is the fact that Buddhism, when it first came to Sri Lanka, we know it was brought by Venerable Mahinda, who was an Arhat, and he came not by any other means, not by walking, by ship or anything, but he used his eruditive powers and he landed on top of Mihintale, and then we saw this heathen king Devanampiya, and he got frightened, etc., and went up and spoke to him. But this fact is never really emphasized or mentioned by anybody in Ceylon. I mean, they don't, as a matter of fact, mention it, and I don't know whether it's even known worldwide or anything for this fact to be interrogated, because if it is interrogated, then we have a miracle, so to speak, in present day terms, right at the center of this story. So I have always wondered why this fact is not mentioned, but I know that learned priests, under whom I was once at Piyadasi and Narada at Vajiraram, I mean, I used to talk to them, and they have written down in books, this is mentioned, but this has always puzzled me as a side. So I wonder whether you had any opinion as to why this is so.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that question. I can only put it into context, So if you look at not just Sri Lanka, all over the world, one of the most fundamental drives every civilization had was to give itself a past so that it has an identity. So all people have what we call myths of origins in sociologist terms. I'm talking as a sociologist. What you just referred to as a story or a historical incident, as a sociologist, I would refer to as a myth of origin. Now, if you listen to my colleague, historian from Colombo University, even Neera Wickramasinghe, historian in Leiden University, they argue that the modern Sinhalese identity is based on 5 key myths, which is from the ancient past. A lot of these myths are also told as records in Mahavamsa, which is the main source of record or this narrative that we go to, right? And Mahavamsa also says this whole story of the lion and the princess and the Vijay and all of that is all of the, so we know that all of this is, they are not, when we call it myth, we don't mean that it's completely a lie. That is not what we mean by a myth. What we mean by a myth is a narrative that people come up with to explain themselves. So the thing is that it can have very historically accurate details or a lot of your imagination also, right? So what are some of the key myths that Sri Lankan Buddhist today would believe? For instance, Buddha's 3 visits to the island. This is also before pre-Vijay, right? We believe that Buddha visited the island twice, right? This is one of the key myths that we believe, our identity is believed. Then the arrival of Vijay, which basically gives us or connects us to the race connects us more with North India, despite all the other archaeological evidence that would show you that we are more connected to South India. But no, we don't want to see it, because our story, our narrative, the beautiful one that we hear up growing, the one that we love, is connecting us to a North Indian princess who fell in love with a lion. So that's the second one. The third is the story of Pandukabaya and the formation of Anuradhapura kingdom, which went on for 1,500 years. So that's the biggest chunk of our history. Anuradhapura, you know, overshadows Polonnaruwa, because Anuradhapura, we believe, is a very strong Buddhist place. By the way, Anuradhapura has a lot of evidence, like the Nestorian cross that emerged, saying that there were other religions present even back in Anuradhapura period, but we overtly see it as a Buddhist kingdom. So formation of Anuradhapura is attributed to Pandukabaya. So that is the third one. You know, you see all these films have been made into movies. That's how you know that they are the fundamental myths of Sri Lanka. The fourth one is Mahindagamani, the one that you referred to, right? And the fifth one is Dutugamunu Elara War. So these 5 key myths, we call them myths of origin, the myths that are fundamental to our modern identity as a Sinhalese Buddhist right now. And all these stories, you will notice, will have supernatural elements in them, right? You know, Irdieng Vedia, you know, or like, what is it, you know, I mean, you know what I'm talking about, because all of you know these stories. All of them have in common supernatural, because that's what people want to feel special, right? So this is just human creativity. For me, this is really human creativity, and it's a good story, and it makes a lovely movie. You know, I would love to watch it if you do that.
But if I may interject, I think this one is a bit more than that, this point, because it is otherwise you have to identify the path that Mahinda took to Sri Lanka, whether you would normally say either he walked across a land bridge or maybe by ship he came. But this is insistently said that the part of the what you call the Buddhist doctrine also, it has been said about acquiring this Arahat state, that if you acquire the Arahat state, some people can get outside powers like going through the air, and then Situl power, constantly going people from Anuradhapura, all that. So this is an element that fascinated me. I completely take your myth story, but here I see a link that you have to pin down, because otherwise there is no Mahinda bringing Buddhism to Ceylon. So either he has to come by land, sea, or as we now say, by air. So that is the only point at the issue. But I take all your 5 points and I see the myth element. But this has always fascinated me, because when they say you have the power and this Mahinda priest acquired it and came, and you know that you have to either accept, prove, or contradict. I mean, that is my problem with this particular fact. That has been the thing that worried me all the time.
This is the thing about stories, right? Now, when we read a novel, we read them as who we are. So these stories, it depends on who you are. If you talk to me, I will look at it as a sociologist, and I will tell you what it means to me as a sociologist. If you speak to a Buddhist will tell you this is what happened, because of course a Buddhist believes, and I'm not doubting them. I cannot say, because I have not done the research to disprove that people have the capacity.
Is the point. That's the point I'm getting at.
Yes.
You know, why doesn't somebody establish this? Did he come by land, sea?
Yes. And the point is that history is also, it does not belong to one. Even if you look at the academic arenas, it doesn't belong to only one discipline. It's not just history. A historian will refer to literary texts like Mahavamsa, Deepavamsa and tell you one story. The archaeologist will go digging and find evidence and bring out material culture and present you and say, okay, this is what I can say. Often it's not a very satisfactory or a beautiful story as what you would find in texts like Mahavamsa, because the here this is just dull rational archaeologist who hasn't got the complete picture. Yeah, so that's archaeology for you. Art historians, like I just did with you in this exercise before, will look at the paintings, look at the architectural details, and give you that perspective, right? So even if you look at the three different disciplines of archaeology, history, and art history, which are all forms of how modern societies interpret history, the past, not history, the past. It's very different according to how you approach it. So if you are a Buddhist, you would approach it very differently. So depending on who you are, the way you construct the past is very different.
Yeah.
And I mean, how do we prove that?
Precisely. But as a scientific person, if you look at it, a scientific point of view, there is a fact there, and we have to establish. But I take your point that now to establish this is very difficult, and that point I fully take for granted. But then rising from it, then we have the other things like, as I just pointed out, then this can come into the category of myths, that in Situl Power in the down south, there were 12,000 or some arahats, and some of them used to go by, that's how the Dhanobudunke Erdenyan now can. I think they are saying that these people sometimes came up from Anuradhapura area to Situl Power through the air. Now that is all that is very contestable. I don't know what the hell. But what I'm saying is this fact has troubled me, that Mahinda, because that is a fact that has to be established, because otherwise there would be no Buddhism coming. So, and we also know that in scientific physical terms, it has to be by either by foot or through land or by sea or by some other means. And they say this is the story there. So, but I take your point that it's very difficult to at this stage to go that far and establish these things. We don't see. But only thing is that they say that even nowadays, in India, there are yogins who are seen like this, that they have acquired side powers where they can float through the air, etc. But all this is very contestable, I see. So I will leave it at that, and thank you very much for what you have said.
But here is, yes, thank you so much. And the thing is, I'm also an oral historian. I'm also a sociologist, so I don't disregard oral traditions and what people say, because that's what they believe, that has a value. It doesn't matter whether that can be proven or not. Who knows? Our scientific knowledge is also limited. That's our limit. So I'm not even saying that is contestable. But what I can actually say is that the focus that we put on Mahinda as the person who brought Buddhism to Sri Lanka. Now, this, if you read, for instance, some researchers, I think Lagdu Singh also wrote about it. I mean, there was Buddhism before Mahinda here. Right? Yes, we know that different forms of Buddhist people lived. The Hinduism was there also, because we have, Civika Sala and all of those things were there. Yes. So the fact that Mahinda brought Buddhism is also, today historians would give you a lot of evidence to say, no, that is probably where the story comes, and maybe Mahinda adopted that at a more state level. So then the spreading of Buddhism was much supported by the fact that Devanampiyatissa Tissa took it.
Precisely, that's the point. Yeah, that is the main thing. This story. That's the thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Exactly. So, but the fact that there was Buddhism before that is also an interpretation that some historians will know better to talk. I mean, I don't have all the evidence in my head, but it's definitely there.
All right, thanks a lot.
Okay, let's go for Tamara.
Sorry, I was not expecting to be called next. I have heard scholars discussing that Arahat Mahinda, being the son of the Emperor Asoka, wouldn't have come unannounced. And King Devanampiyatissa would have known about his arrival, but to maintain the magic or the as we were just discussing, to have that kind of a story would have been more entertaining. So just sharing that as well. I think basically, just to go to some other things we were discussing, I think rather than thinking either we are Sinhalese or whatnot, it might be a better way of knowing a person's identity. It might be a good thing to say, I come from Sri Lanka, my hometown is such and such, and I speak, my first language is Sinhalese, and I follow Buddhism as a religion. So it's a very complex, but I think it is a better explanation of somebody.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Okay, let's go for in order of appearance. Devinda, you came and you went, but I'll give you the chance. Devinda?
Oh, thank you, Ron. Thank you. Closing remarks, brilliant again for the talk. Is there an opportunity to work with people outside Sri Lanka, with like-minded people, in terms of discussing the history of Sri Lanka and race issues? Like in UK, you have David Olusoga, and there are lots of interesting Southeast Asian art historians and anthropologists and archaeologists. Is there an appetite or an opportunity in Sri Lanka to work with people outside? Because clearly you have a lot of knowledge that we could enhance the history and the future of Sri Lanka.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's really what we should be doing, especially in history. Like for me, one of the issues that I often see within the island is that it's very insular, even the university system, you know, it works simply within itself. So that's a real limitation. And a lot of it comes also from, unfortunately, language, you know, the inability to sort of, you know, work with the outside world, so to say. So the ones who do, there are people who do it, but then they are very limited, you know, and often, now for instance, Professor Neera Wickramasinghe, who is the chair of the South Asian Studies in Leiden University, a Sri Lankan scholar who really works with all the international scholars in the arena right now. She's in Leiden. You should invite, if you haven't already, Professor Sujit Sivasundaram, Sri Lankan professor of world history at Cambridge University. He's a very good colleague of mine. He wrote a brilliant book called Waves Across the South, where he actually studies 5 different islands, including Sri Lanka, Tasmania, Mauritius, all of that, right? Here are Sri Lankan historians doing amazing work and, you know, really approaching the history the way I feel should be approached, I feel would serve our future, our population, to move forward from where they are. But unfortunately, they are either unable to be inside the island and work, you know. So like all of us who do this kind of work, we have one leg here, one leg outside. Often they also get much better opportunities. I mean, Sujit is never going to leave his chair at Cambridge and come back to Sri Lanka, but he tries a lot. He engages a lot with Columbia University, Jaffna University, all of that. I highly recommend him also because you all were all interested in colonial history. So Sujit does a lot of work on colonial history, on British history, etc. Neera Wickramasinghe does a lot of history on Dutch history. So we do have world-class historians, but unfortunately they also write in English, they publish in English, they are outside. I mean, we try a lot. Now, for instance, I work with a British archaeologist called Professor Jill Julef from Exeter. She has been coming to Sri Lanka since 1980s. She did a PhD thesis in Anuradhapura. She was right there when the Sri Mahabodhi was attacked by the LTT. She took me to the place and showed me how the bullets, the embedded bullets within the bow trees, you know, it's still there. You can still touch it, you know, all of that. Talk about memory and passing on all these things. And so they try a lot to work with universities in Sri Lanka. And that's why I really find it's important to collaborate with UK universities or wherever, you know, Western universities, because they bring fresh perspectives, and that's really interesting collaboration. But unfortunately, from our side, you know, every time I try to even sort of, you know, get information about all these opportunities that are out there right now, about fellowships, opportunities for young graduates, what limits us in our Colombo University, Jaffna University, is our language issue that the younger generation is experiencing. But apart from that, yeah, there are some people that are doing really brilliant work.
Is there South Indian scholars who are really sympathetic and wants to work with people like you or not? The academia in India? No.
South India, I mean, this should just be my limit, honestly.
Yeah.
I do not personally know or have, you know, my again, because I studied in Delhi, again, it is just personal things, you know. I have more connections there, but I do know Sanatan, and my colleague from Jaffna University. He has a very good base in South India. Then we have also from Department of Fine Arts in Jaffna University, Dr. Parkinathan Ahilan, who is actually doing his PhD thesis on Tamil Buddhism. So that's an interesting, he's just finishing his PhD from Madurai. So he knows a lot of Tamil, you know, intellectuals and South Indian intellectuals that we can collaborate with. And I think it's really an important point taken, not just with the West. I think we should really collaborate a lot with South India and the region in general. That's very, very valid point raised, Davinder. Thank you for bringing that up.
My last point, just to, in a slightly humorous point, because we have a lot of influence from China. I know China is investing heavily on some of the monasteries and temples indirectly, but do you think they would be a good alliance for you in terms of actually they might be interested to support your work if you approach them? I don't know.
I mean, okay, the point is about the kind of critical work that I'm doing. Yeah. So the work that I'm doing is very critical and analytical. Chinese agenda doesn't quite fit there. So I don't really see that. But the thing is that, of course, China, historically, I don't deny the kinds of connections that we've had with China. You cannot really talk about Sri Lanka without talking about the Oceanic Silk Route. You can refer to the works of people like Indian historian Romila Thapar and Professor Sudarshan Senivaratna, Sri Lankan ambassador to former to India, now to Bangladesh. So all of them have done excellent work on the Oceanic Silk Route, our connections with China. So that is a historical fact that we have been very linked with China, and it's something that I also write about in my book, Shared Sanctity. The first chapter that I write about is really about the Oceanic Silk Route and how that sort of do that. So I cannot discuss it without China. But the problem is the political agenda that is there, and how do we sort of draw a line that is there. Even the museums, I know that the Gaul Museum has been supported by China. Then there's suddenly a gallery completely about China, you know, there. So this is the tricky part of balancing the politics and the kind of research that we do, and whom we are serving in the end. For me, what's important is that I remain the research that I do promote real questioning and thinking for Sri Lankans to create a bit better, more inclusive future. I don't really see sometimes the Chinese, the big agenda fitting there quite a bit. So I would say it's problematic.
Okay, let's
Thank you.
move on.
Thank you.
Charles, I have seen you trying to raise your hand, but there are two other people before you. So I'll come back to you. Newton first, and then Dyke, and then Charles. Be fairly quick because we have about 15 minutes more.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the fantastic lecture. The thing I want to tell you is Professor Raj Somadeva has found evidence to show very clearly Buddhism existed long before King Devanampiya is here. That's the first one. And in fact, if someone is interested to know about the history, there's a fantastic, some lecture series is going on at the moment in the YouTube. Anybody can watch that via NetFM Unlimited History. So there are so many very interesting YouTube details are available there. And number two, I want to tell you is that earlier Talemana and Dhanuskodi were it was completely connected. Even now, actually, there are only 13 islands to cross at the moment. From Talemana on a clear sky, we can, pair of binoculars, we can watch some of the things which are happening at Dhanuskodi. I myself have, watched that with some of my colleagues from the Vayu Center. So even there are some lights and the signal lights and so forth. Those are the two things to say. So this, just to say, we are very close to, the India. And in fact, when it was connected, so much of common fauna flora had been, found in both in India and in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the tip on NetFM, because this is again, this is why history is such a fascinating arena, because it doesn't just belong to historians, it just doesn't belong to archaeologists, it belongs to everybody, and everybody is creating history, everybody is interpreting, everybody is talking about it. So that's what makes it really interesting and fascinating to sort of work on. The thing about Talemana, I have stories in my own family where I was told that my grandparents and granduncle has stories about just going to who were at that time working in Talemana. They used to take a boat and go to Dhanushkodi and go there and watch a film and come back, so yes. People, this whole of borders that exist for us right now didn't quite exist at that time. So people used to just ferry across and go watch a film Friday night and come back. This I have heard from my own oral history of my own family, people who used to tell me. So I think we are very, very close, simply that geographical closeness, and there's immense evidence especially if you go into paleontology, geological history and all of that to show how linked we are in terms of the two countries. So honestly, our connection to South India can't be denied at all or taken out.
Thank you. Let's move on to Daika.
Hello, Hasini. Thank you for the talk. It was fascinating. My question may have been asked by others before. It's relating to Polonnaruwa and the Sandakadapana. There is a description to say that the Sandakadapana in Polonnaruwa is different from the one in Anuradhapura because it has taken out the bull, which was Shiva's vehicle, and hence people should not step on it. Now, it's Professor Paranavitan who describes the Sandakadapana in a sort of a symbolic manner to say that this is the passage of people traveling towards nirvana. Do you think it is just this, his vivid imagination mention that he symbolized it that way? Or is there any actual document or anything that states that that is what it symbolically represents? Or is it just decorative? Because there are semicircles and circles of that sort in Greek and Roman. There are designs as well. For instance, their ceramic floors have this sort of design with animals, etc. So that's the question that I have. The other is about the Tevanka image house. I mean, I can't remember. I have visited Polonnaruwa, but I can't still remember that. Maybe I missed it. And one of the observations about the frescoes there, and its similarity to the one in Ajanta and Sigiriya, is that our artists, who did these paintings, in order to create this sort of three-dimensional roundness of the flesh. Now you see it very well in the Sigiriya frescoes as well. It's not only that sharp line, the sharp external line is there, but they merged the interior, they just sort of smudged it a little bit. And that creates this roundness. Now that is actually, if you study Western art, they didn't use that technique. If you look at some of the sort of classical Western art, for instance, they used directional light and create a sort of large shadows. Hence, all those paintings are in sort of semi-darkness, while as our paintings that we have in our classical tradition is in bright light and depicts it very beautifully. So the question is the one about the yes.
Well, I mean, what we do, I mean, Sandakatapahana is something that you learn in school also. One of the most famous example of the Hindu influence. But for me, again, like I feel, this is no offense to historians that have worked before. I think the work of Paranavitana is amazing and his interpretations are amazing. But for me, the issue is that we need to continue to study it further, improve on it, put it in context. This is exactly what you are saying. It's, if you also study Sandakatapahana's, something similar elsewhere in the world, then we are also able to see it in a different light, So I think we need to there is something about us that, we are given an explanation and then we are so happy with it and that's the truth and we never question it simply because our critical thinking skills are a little bit, not quite up there. And innovation skills, thinking of things differently, looking at them and thinking like now even the Sigiriya, the explanation for Sigiriya Apsaras, right? I mean, we have the Meghalata and Vijulata and Parnavitana. I mean, he's done excellent work. He's, all of that. So absolutely, I'm not saying anything lessening him or in any way. But what I'm saying is that we need to build on that. And to put them in context of the region, of other parts of the world, to understand, if we want to deepen our understanding. So I'm unable to give you an answer to that because we haven't done that. And I also don't have the access to that kind of research. I haven't read that kind of research to answer your question on that. Like, is it really that? I don't know. If I studied further, if I research it further, and I think really hard, maybe I can also come up with an alternative interpretation of it. So, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say. But a lot of things that we think unique is not so unique because we know that some things that are very similar is everywhere. You find this in India, and it's there all the time. Yeah, and this point on paintings and ateliers that you're talking about, so it shows. Now today we go, no, I mean we will go and learn art history somewhere else, we will go and do a residency here, there, so similar to that, our own artists sort of traveled and studied there, came back, painted here. Those people, sort of came here and learned and went. So the other thing that we always think is that we think Sri Lanka is like a place where we were at the receiving end. Everything came from India. You know, Jagat says beautifully, Jagat Veera Singh, Professor Jagat Veera Singh, says everything didn't come from India. You know, there's no India to come from the beginning. Like, and there's this concept of India is also weird. You know, there was no India to come from, and we weren't at the receiving end. We were also agents or people with our own thing. For instance, if you listen to the architect Anjalendra, he has a fascinating explanation of Vatadagi. He says, I have not gone and seen it. He says there is a structure in South India, Kerala, which is very similar to Vatadagi in what you get in Polonnaruwa. And actually his argument is not that it came from there to here, but that it went from here to there, you know. So all of this happened, and the thing is, right now the ways of really knowing the past completely is not there, and we must also sort of be aware of the fact that we may never know the right answer. We might not really know the complete truth is lost to us. Because we have lost knowledge systems, we have knowledge part of the evidence, all of that. So knowing the total truth or the whole story when it comes to history is not quite possible. I mean, can you know the whole truth about something that happened yesterday? No, right? There are so many interpretations. One channel will say one thing, the other channel will say another thing. You know, there are so lots of different ideas. So if you can't get the truth or whole story about something that happened yesterday, how is it possible to say something totally true about something that happened 2000 years ago? This is impossible. I think we just have to understand history and historiography in modern context, yeah, and how we can use it to create our future, to build our future. That for me is the way I, at least in my opinion, the way we can move forward with it.
Thank you. Tamara. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, just to ask one more thing. I have read and then I have seen at the Tivanka Pilima Gaze as well that the posture of the Buddha statue, say it has 3 curves, and that it has been done purposely to incorporating the dancing stance of Lord Shiva. Is it correct or?
So yes, so we have 2 interpretations of the story. So Tivanka, Tribanga, comes from the word thrice bent, Tivanka, thrice bent. So you have a bend in the neck, bend in the hip, and bend on the knee. So it's, and if you really look at classical dancing or Indian classical dancing, this is the Tribanga that the dancers will take. And if you go to Orissa and go visit the Sun Temple, this is always the figure, the way in which your figure will be carved, especially to show feminine features and movement would be Tribanga, you know, to give the statue a sense of dynamism and lived reality and life. You make it that way. So again, it's not unique to Sri Lanka. It's not unique to Tivanka. But Tivanka, the name really, Tivanka, the name at least, most historians agree comes from that statue. So the problem is we cannot really identify the statue. Mostly we think it's a Buddhist statue, Buddha statue, but the statue does not have the head. We have not recovered it. There's no head, so we cannot identify it. One is that is a Buddha. One is that is God, you know, from a Hindu God, and the other is also the Bodhisattva. It's a Bodhisattva figure because Bodhisattva worship was very, very common. We know also in the sacred quadrangle, I don't know if you can remember, if you go there, there is a Bodhisattva figure just a little bit away from the Vatadagi also. There's a Bodhisattva figure. So Bodhisattva figures are everywhere in Sri Lanka. So the other important, other plausible explanation for it is actually a Bodhisattva figure. So these are, I mean, how do we know? We have a statue, which at the moment is exposed brick. It was definitely painted in 11th century BC, 11th century, sorry, not Common Era. And we don't have the head, so we cannot identify it really. And I don't know, we have to look at the literature, read a little bit deeper about it to see if we can get any clues. But I mean, looking at it, I would say plausible to be a bodhisattva. My feeling is more towards a bodhisattva figure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so one last question, comment. You were telling us that although the Polonnaruwa ruins are a mixture of Tamil and Sinhalese, the museums tend to separate them. Now, I think that could be the educational establishment, because, you know, look at medicine. You will have, when we see medicine, when we learn medicine, we divide the systems into gastrointestinal, neurology, whatever other systems. And then there are some experts only on that particular area. But at the end of the day, it's all about the whole body. So similarly, maybe the education establishment is feeling that it's easier to divide it and study, whereas we need to have the whole context. So that's basically a comment. It's not, may not be necessarily a bad thing. Just a comment.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's also why we have incomplete truths, because we are not approaching it holistically. Just take, I mean, forget about the difference between science and arts and all of that. Just think of the past. How many now, archaeologists, historians, museologists, art historians, all of these, but how often are these people talking to each other? Not very often. Not very often that an archaeologist talks to a historian, right? Not very often, sadly. So, so this is, again, this is, I don't want to blame everything on the West, but this is also the Western system of, you know, different disciplines and approaching specialization is an approach that came out of that scientific method. Whereas if you look at the more Eastern societies, you have more holistic systems of knowledge. For instance, the Eastern medicine, if you take it, it's not just science about medicine, right? There are there's all these it's all about horoscopes and you know, other forms of things. If you take the more Eastern ways of treating a certain illness, it's about yoga, it's about you know, so it's a much more different approach than you know, just separating it at this is medicine and this is different. You know, you would even you will go and do a bodhi puja to recover from your illness. Also, that is also part of the medication. No, I mean, just as much as you. So the Eastern cultures had much more holistic approaches in terms of knowledge creation and knowledge production, vis-a-vis the Western systems that you and I are brought up in. So I mean, I also am completely brought up in a Western education system. So I also unfortunately think like that, and that's my limit. Yeah.
Okay, I just got a sudden thought block. Charles, did I give you a chance to ask your question or not? Charles Kodikara? You need to unmute.
Can you unmute, please, Charles?
Go on. Yeah, you unmuted and muted again.
Try once more. Good. Now you're okay.
Right. One should mention that the Chinese monk who visited Sri Lanka had mentioned that he had visited Mahendra Vihara in South India before coming to Sri Lanka. Therefore, that shows that Mihindu came to South India, and from South India came to Sri Lanka probably by boat, not by air. Therefore, you can believe people coming through air, but really he came through boat. He came to South India, and there he visited the he had a temple called Mahendra Vihara or Mihindu Vihara in South India. Then he visited Sri Lanka. Therefore, you can believe in flying through air, but really he came to South India, then visited Sri Lanka by boat. Therefore, you can believe in myth or the reality. The truth is that Mahendra came to South India. From there, he established a temple there, and it was visited by the visiting Chinese monk many centuries later. Therefore, you can believe whatever you want to believe.
Yes,
but Professor Haputhantri, I believe there is real natural explanation. How he
absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a much more natural and much more plausible explanation, because we know that I mean, you go to a museum in Madras, National Museum in Madras, you see how many Buddhist statues are there. It's a lot of Buddhist statues, and it's all Tamil Buddhist statues, from Tamil Nadu area. Very different in terms of art, like the face and all of that, very different from the North Indian or Gandhara style of Buddhist thing. So, I mean, there was Buddhism in South India quite a lot. So, and people traveling through all these is very, very common. So definitely much more plausible experience. But it's also like it's about narratives. People write stories, and these stories are also important part of our belief system. So yeah, so when I approach it, I don't completely disregard it, because it's not, for me, it's not a matter of whether it's true or false. That's not a helpful question to me, or that's not even the question I'm trying to answer. Whether it's true or false is besides the point. The point is how much validity does the people give it. So people believe it. I mean, all the Christians believe in Immaculate Conception. I mean, whether it is real or not is irrelevant in my opinion. So it's what people believe, and history is what people write down and what we try to do that. But of course, that's probably how it happened. I mean, there are a lot of things that we can question. For instance, we can very easily question, do you really think it's the tooth of the Buddha right there in Dalada Maligaon? You can question that, but and we don't know. Nobody has proven it. Nobody has done a DNA test on it to say that that's what it is, and nobody would even dare to ask that question. It can be asked, but the thing is that people believe, and sometimes that is also very, very valid in contexts like ours.
Okay, last question for Shihan.
Hello, Ruan. Just a very quick one. Actually, it's not to Hasini, but it's to Dr. Kodikara. I would very much like some details of the story which I heard from him. That kind of partly answers my question I put to Hasini. So I would be very much interested if he can give some sort of answer. Not now, maybe later. And the other thing is, again, I just caught on the last one, which Hasini mentioned about the Dalada. Now, this also has been very much contested, but here is another mythical, magical story coming from my own family, because there is one of my mother's first cousins. He was a planter in Matugama, and his house had some kind of property where all these dhatus used to come into water things and all that, and it was very famous that his house, there were queues, people coming to watch these things. And his brother, who was a professor at University of Ceylon, Professor Hiran Dias, told me about a couple of years ago, when the Kandy Dalada Maligaon was under attack in the LTT time, this Dalada Vahanse, and the head priest knows this, had apparently, the story is this, flown to my cousin's house in Matugama, and the priest had phoned and asked, Mahatya, ඔය තියනවාද ඕක ඇවිල්ලා තියනවාද කියලා. Then he had said, yes, it has come here. And then the story is after about 3 weeks when things settled down, this thing spontaneously went back into the relic cage in Kandy, and the priest had said, so these are the kinds of myths, modern day myths that are there, and we have no way of verifying this or who is to say this didn't happen. So I'll just leave at that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. And I think that's a great conversation for us to have. Yeah.
Right. So at this point, I would ask everybody to put on your videos and unmute yourselves, please, so that we could thank Hasini. Hasini, thank you very much for your lovely lecture and spending almost, well, more than 3 hours with us. And we are very, very grateful for you. And as usual, let us all thank her in our YouTube day. Thank you very much, Hasini.
Thank you so much from my side. Thank you for inviting and organizing this. And thank you really for your patience and your really insightful remarks and this really open, honest dialogue. Very much appreciated. And it's lovely to be part of forums like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.